Welcome to VR Day, the first virtual reality meeting in Paraíba, Brazil, supported by the federal government, by Aldir Blanc Law, and the Municipal City Hall of João Pessoa. It's a pleasure to be with Steven and João Pedro in this lecture. O orador especial de hoje é Steven. Steven é artista, escritor e diretor de jogos de realidade mista e vem com o tema Criando Mundos de Realidade Mista para o Metaverso. Steven é um criador de jogos, escritor com o livro Design de Narrativa Original, formado pela Universidade da Califórnia School of Cinematic Arts, enquanto bolsista da Electronic Arts e da David Lynch Foundation. Seu trabalho abrange desde a escrita de shows para os principais parques temáticos, VR e AR, jogos móveis, e Dinart trabalhou como franquias em personagens de franquias que vão desde a Universo Marvel e Mario até o Batman e o Senhor dos Anéis. It's a pleasure receiving you, Steven, in the VR Day.
Thanks so much for having me, Priscilla.
Right, and I'm the co-host, John Pedro, call me JP, from 20XR Education. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and talk to a legend. And all right, Steven. So first of all, we are extremely delighted to having you here. And there's nowadays we are seeing this huge trend growing around the metaverse, and you are in the forefront of the movement in so many different areas. And we want to talk about something that a lot of people, unfortunately, they're not aware of that still, which is storytelling, narrative design, and especially your field, narrative design itself, before we move into your current work, but before we start with, because there are two questions that we want to ask you. First one is going to be about narrative design, and the second one about your work as a narrative designer. But we want to know a little bit about Steven Dinehart IV and your background in this amazing universe. So please feel free to tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I don't know. I've worked in entertainment for a while now. Not too long, I suppose, but
right.
My first proper client in the entertainment space was in the late 90s. And I guess this is the 17th anniversary of the release of Constantine, which was my first big video game that I got real credit on. And the film came out. It was really an ambitious project. And it gave me a real hunger to work in this space to try to tell new kinds of stories as they, spanned across different media formats.
Wow, that's amazing. And so tell us a little bit about that, and tell us a little bit about narrative design and the role, how you developed that, and how it grew to what it is right now. Tell us a little bit about narrative design itself. We're very curious about it.
A lot of it comes from my experience, both in education and in the field. So a lot of it sort of is founded by a range of disciplines that kind of were brought together really when I was at USC at the cinema school there, getting my graduate degree. I was really able to focus on this stuff. And a lot of people at the time were particularly obsessed with mechanics, and they called it a play-centric approach. And I really like a play-centric approach, but for me, the stories in the games I've loved for most of my life, and especially as a child, really came from the stories that were generated by these games that I experienced, and the feeling that I was in another space. Almost like, reading a good novel or watching a good movie. The difference here was, rather than being in an observatory mode or an observation mode, kind of watching over a character or maybe alongside them in their mind as the novel, here in the game, you were actually able to be a character. And that was always really exciting. So the focus of my work is how to create stories through interactive mediums that hopefully give those sorts of feelings that we expect from more traditional and established media formats, but in a new and different way, because we have our audience as active protagonists. So there's a lot of stuff that comes from, you know, traditional writing and screenwriting and filmmaking, but it's applied to digital media and particularly to the database. That's a special form. And understanding how to structure interactive databases in order to serve up content to your user that creates a meaningful experience.
So narrative design comes from, so it is built around the media that's going to be translated into. So for example, if you're creating a world, which leads to the next question, how it is to create a virtual world, like mixed reality and mixed reality. And so narrative design takes into account data, takes into account the storytelling behind the experience that every user is going to have. But it's very user-centric from what you said. Am I right?
Yeah, sure. It's, you know, user experience is sometimes an easier way to understand it for some.
Right.
And there's certainly a lot of people that work in user experience design that sort of focus on similar aspects.
Right.
You know, I would say a good way to approach it. So narrative design itself as a discipline outside of interactive did exist to some extent prior to my creation of the narrative design. Really, the stuff that I have kind of created out of working in this is I call interactive narrative design. You know, other people might approach it differently, but I think that's a good way to approach it, because we are concerned with the design of the narrative, but the interactivity element is important. And what that is what someone is doing. So it really kind of relates to the mechanics, the fundamental elements of a world that you're building. How does someone in this world take action?
Right.
What does that look like? How do they get feedback from that world in order to achieve something? And desires in games can range from, you know, a range of things, and you can sort of create desires in people, or at least hope to, that drives them towards a goal. So how does the world react as they act towards achieving a goal? And again, a lot of this comes from almost like classic storytelling stuff, really from all the way back to Aristotle. And but the approach that we take is thinking about it from an interactive form, because our goal at the end of the day is to make a meaningful play experience where a player, a viewer, feels like an actor, and that their actions are meaningful and have had meaningful ramifications in the context of the story itself. So, you know, before, my first virtual world I made was in 1998. I directed a team of people to create this online, you know, it was all 2D. It was all basically done with Adobe products. You know, this is way back in the day, and there was a little map you can go, and there was mini activities. There was animated content. It was meant for kids. And there was some books offline and action figures and stuff. And while I would say that's a situation where, as a discipline, I didn't really have interactive narrative design. We put a bunch of games in there. It was designed in a very attractive way to appeal to the audience. But the activities themselves maybe weren't so tightly tied to the world we were trying to create. So innately, there are stories that kind of came out of that simple system, but because we didn't really think of the meaning behind the activities we were doing, you know, a game Fishing with Buford just was a fun fishing game. It wasn't necessarily tied to, you know, the greater story, and things that happened in that little mini game didn't really have any implications or on the greater story as told, right? So the way I approach it these days is, you know, a great example being a similar sort of world, Super Nintendo world. You know, there's one opening soon here in the United States, and there's already one open in Osaka. And so I tell people it's sort of like Wreck-It Ralph. And the real goal is to make it so that your activities doing one sort of mini game, say like a Mario Kart, have impact on the rest of your experience as you're adventuring through the land. And that's really what you're trying to do, is further suspend disbelief, which is sort of the classic thing that you try to do in a lot of cinema storytelling and whatnot. But here we're really trying to push that further and make people feel like their actions have meaning in this sort of mixed reality or virtual space.
So you talked about the interaction and that how it impacts the narrative, right? So because it is like something that conditions another, like you were talking about the interaction regarding the narrative around it. Mm-hmm. So how it is like to build worlds, different worlds with different interactions using narrative design? Like how first of all, like how what it's like to be a narrative designer and to consider these different interactions in the creation of mixed reality worlds, or you name it, like if it's 2D, it's 3D, like virtual reality or mixed reality, you name it. Like what is like to build for every field, every interaction, a narrative?
Well, it's sort of innate, right? It exists. We as creatures, as beings, are sort of storytelling machines, right? So if you give someone a sequence of images, chances are, if there's any kind of correlations they can draw between those images, they might start to create a story. Now that story may or may not exist as intent through the images in that sequence, or it could be something that we sort of make up in our heads. Now, the real goal is to try to make something where our heads and that sort of natural process we have of creating story through action and then telling someone, saying, hey, I went to the store, I saw, my friend, and she invited me over to dinner tonight. And so I bought this roast that I'm going to bring. So here we have a story about an encounter, an interaction with a friend, and suddenly we have a little bit of a plot, right? We're going to a dinner party tonight, right? It's just sort of how we're built. And this comes back, I mean, animals do this as well. Something I talk about a little bit in my book called Narrative Designer. So it's really something that's a survival skill. So, and the fun of being in this space is we're not so much using it for survival, although we could talk about, the merits of art and entertainment, but we're doing it for fun. We're doing it to create catharsis. We're doing it to create drama and interesting situations that hopefully give people great emotions, great experiences, and help them, to think.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun. It's a new space, and in some ways, I say that game design is a subset of narrative design because, I do a lot of game design, but I approach it differently. And rather than simply thinking, hey, will it be, does it work if I'm picking up my phone? Oh, you can't see my phone. Right. Does it work, when I'm picking up a weapon? So much as why are you picking up a weapon?
Of course.
What does that have to do with the greater story or message that we're trying to communicate with someone?
It goes deeper.
How is that? Yeah, exactly. How is that lending itself to the creation of a story? Now you can approach this sort of backwards, which I've had to do before, and you say, well, we have these mechanics that we built. How do we take this mismatch of stuff and create some meaning out of it? And the reason that the position was created, these days it's in a lot of different sectors. I mean, it's used in the military, it's used in law enforcement, it's used in entertainment, gosh knows where else, quite frankly. When it started, though, it really came out of a need because, back in 2005, when probably this idea first began in this gentleman's head, Tardine Williams, who contacted me to make this position, he was working on a game called Medal of Honor. And he realized they needed to be someone that was in charge of the story. Now, we all love story, but in games, we didn't really have someone to be what we called the champion of story.
Right.
And a lot of times back then, particularly, you would have sort of what people call a ludonarrative dissonance, which I don't really believe in aside from bad design. And so that is what you're doing and the story itself, they seem separate, like not attached or related. And so that's really bad interactive design, bad game design, but it was very typical of games at the time and still is to some extent. So my job as a narrative designer is to try to say, well, how do we have it feel like that story that we want to tell is also mapped to the gameplay? So what people are doing, what players are doing, how is that actually driving our story? So that when you do get to a big story arc point, whether it's a plot point, even if it's a canned cinematic, it still feels like it was driven out of the player's actions, and that it works in the context of the narrative you're trying to tell. And narratives can be very basic. They don't have to necessarily be very complex dramas, but they're usually about conflict and about a protagonist trying to achieve something.
We have now, like, we are entering, like, now a lot of people, like, we have Web3, on the way. We have Metaverse being more commercialized. Now a lot of people have this, it's a trending topic now, Metaverse everywhere. And now we are entering this new phase with 6 degrees of freedom, 6 headsets around. By the time they're being more affordable, like Oculus Quest 2. So we are entering this new phase of immersiveness, let's put it like that. So we have immersion. And like one key aspect of what you said is that what, from my understanding, is that narrative design takes the whole interaction in place and really brings the person into the experience, correlated and very much ingrained with the context of the game, of the experience itself, attached to the story. So the story and the player, the user, they are combined, they're interacting. It makes sense for the user, is literally part of the story. And I play a lot of games throughout my life. I play a lot of different video games, and I never felt, some games I felt attached to it. Like I had an emotional attachment to it.
Right.
Since now we are going to this immersive environment now, like let's think about the next 10 years. Do you have high hopes that all companies focus on narrative design even more because of this, the specifics of the metaverse?
Well, I think just that interactivity is something that anyone that's dealing with a brand is going to want to think about more and more, because whether it's just clicking on Twitter or in an MMO, you need to have an understanding of what those interactions are communicating and how they're making people feel, right? And you can design that to create different sorts of experiences. If you wanted to create a horror experience or a romance experience, or maybe something that felt more like banking software, you'd probably approach it differently in order to communicate different things with your audience. So I do think it's something that is applicable in a lot of ways to all sorts of sectors. But do I see a lot of people hiring outside of entertainment for it? Not necessarily. Even in the context of entertainment, I could see some places where people might say, "Hey, we don't need that rule." But I think having the skill set is really important, and especially as we do move into creating worlds online that people can step into. Whether they're in this metaverse fashion, carrying a character with them or content with them, creating more believable spaces that are also more healthy, is an important aspect. So it's one thing to use a technology; it's another thing to use it well. So I think one great aspect of the questions that you sort of go through when approaching things from a story perspective and really a brand perspective is what are we saying? Why are we saying this? How do we say this? And I think that those are good questions for any creator as they're trying to communicate with an audience.
Okay, so it's, yeah, because it ends up being different. Like you have business goals, but you also have the experience, like the goals with the experience itself. So as you said, like a bank, they probably, like in the future, we're going to see banks jumping into the metaverse with different solutions and different, like, let's say customer support or something, or just a pipeline
Yeah,
for communication. And
yeah, you hear people sometimes say the experience economy, and
yeah,
this is something that will bleed over, or is bleeding over into the metaverse as well, because you see a lot of, let's say, well, I won't pick on particular companies, but a lot of folks that moved into this space early that tried to create standalone virtual reality products ended up having it be events driven, and now we have these events that are being at least positioned as metaverse events
right.
in places like Roblox or Fortnite.
Yeah.
And again, what we're talking about is an experience, an event that you're inviting people to, that hopefully at the end of the day, like any good marketer, you want people to go and talk about that experience. You want them to tell their friends about it, right? And so I really try to design to that. It's sort of like I tell people, I love to write, I love storytelling, but if I really was just a storyteller, I'd go write a book. Maybe I'd go just do a film, and I love both of those. But in the context of interactivity in the game, while we are in some ways telling our story, it's really about our audience's story, and having them create something through the system. So when I feel like I did my job is when someone is able to tell a story after experiencing one of my projects that matches my design attempts. And then I go, oh, okay, yeah, there we go. That's what we wanted. So, with Super Nintendo World, if someone feels like they're Mario for a moment, if they feel like they're in the Mushroom Kingdom for a moment,
Exactly.
if they feel like they've had an interaction with Princess Peach, and even if just for a moment, suspending that disbelief enough so that it does feel like they are inside the metaverse, this sort of mixed space with digital and actual. In some ways, it's like, one of my favorite films, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, this mix of sort of cartoon and reality. And that's
that was awesome.
Sort of where we are now, where people are doing it, except with this digital space. And, a lot of it does almost look sort of cartoony now. And, the technology will advance and it'll become more photorealistic. But, there'll always be the space for the virtual. But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see especially what's going to happen in the mixed reality world. And let's say, like right now, we are having a lot of different experiences around augmented reality, and mixed reality is still like in the works for some headsets. For example, we have HoloLens, and we have now Snap AR. They're doing great things, and we are seeing all these different hardwares coming along. Like, are you excited for the next 10 years in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, technology is always a fun sector to work in. And, the interesting thing about being a lifelong nerd is that all of a sudden now it's cool. And, people are really interested in it, which, has some neat aspects. It also makes it more competitive. But there's a lot of money going to the space. So, that's what gets me excited about the moves that Meta is making. They're taking some big risks and actually is helping kind of move this space forward. And without the money in the space, that wouldn't happen so much. And that's why we have so much virtual reality out there. Now, augmented reality, mixed reality, virtual reality, virtual production. We have all these different terms to talk about sort of, these different blends of virtual and actual. I'm not sure if they're terms we'll use for too long. Virtual reality has been around for a while, but we'll probably come up with some different terms for it. And, what it is, though, is that same sort of drive that sort of brought video games around to begin with, except rather than just moving stuff on the screen, we're trying to step inside of it. Right. And we live in a time where that's possible. I mean, even to some extent, what we're doing right now, our conversation, this is a virtual conversation, right? Exactly. We're not in the same space. It's being recorded. It seems very real. I feel like we were having this presence together,
Yeah,
but we're all in very different spaces. So in some ways, you know, this is a virtual reality that's
exactly.
being facilitated by data. No, it's not 3D. No, we don't have a headset on. And so one of the talks actually, Priscilla mentioned, I give sometimes, and it's sort of like, what is reality? What's the nature of reality? And how do we deliver things? Because at the end of the day, as much as I like very real things, and this is what appeals to me about theme parks, is things you can touch and hold. Um, we do work in the space of trickery. One of my favorite films about that is Orson Welles' F is for Fake. And the interesting discussion around media. And right now, I think all around the world, we're experiencing, you know, a lot of interesting things happening as a result of media. And people are trying to ban media and say things about it. But I think at the end of the day, what we need to have is people that can think better and are able to know fake from real. And, you know, we're all intelligent enough, I think, to do that. But we live in a time where people don't believe things they see, right?
Yeah,
I had an instance recently on social media where some people were accusing me of being someone I am not, posting a fake review. And it's almost scary, because here's a real person, and they've
yeah,
gone and put these videos up and said, no, this is real. But
right.
not only didn't they have to say, hey, I'm a real
Yeah,
person, look at this video, they had to say, this isn't a deep fake. I'm not
yeah,
computer generated, which
exactly.
is a little scary that that's how far we've come into this
Yeah,
virtual reality.
yeah,
So I'd argue
That's
that to
right.
some extent right now, we live in a world that's so mediated,
yeah,
at least all of us that are online for the most
y-
part,
yeah,
that to some extent, what we think is the world is a virtual world, and not, you know, the real world that, say, you
yeah.
know, animals outside live it day to day.
Yeah, especially when we have social media and different experiences inside social media and different social components being translated into and being conditioned by an algorithm. Now, like, what is reality? Like even like a social media platform can be a virtual reality for some. Like it's very curious to like to fathom how we're gonna look back and kind of like, all right, so what was that period like? Everything was
Right. Well,
virtual
and
reality.
yeah, well, you know, I like to think that we'll become literate enough in this
Yeah,
new form that we'll be able to tell the difference. Because there was a time with the novel, when
yeah,
people were worried that, hey, if you read too many books, man, you might go a
yeah,
little crazy, right? You might not be able to discern the book from reality. This happens in video games too. You know,
yeah, that's
Mortal
true.
Kombat, you know, the classic example. People thought it was so ultra violent and awful that it would bring people to, particularly children, to go do
Mm.
violent things. And we can all sort of laugh about it now and go look at, you know, newer versions of Mortal Kombat are pretty gory, but the technology evolves. And you look back at the old stuff, like I've been replaying a GTA with my son recently, and it's almost comic now. We took it so seriously. But if you look at GTA 3 and GTA 4, I mean, they're not very realistic in any way.
Exactly.
So hopefully that as the general public becomes more literate in these types of media, they'll be able to discern fact from fiction a little better, and we won't
Of
be
course.
lost in this space. But right now, I mean, to some extent, it's used against us. And part of the problem is that technology moves so fast. There's not a lot of room for adaptation.
Exactly.
Um,
Do you think that narrative design plays a role? Like it's so deep and like it opens a room for critical thinking, and it opens more room for the user to be more, immersive, immersed into the experience. Therefore, he contemplates the experience a little bit more. Maybe like if it can be even translated into education in the future, maybe.
Oh yeah, I mean, in an educational context, it's very applicable. But again, and this is why to some extent it can be used very well by a propagandist as well. You know, and for a little while, I mean, as paranoid as it sounds, I almost didn't release some of my stuff because it could be used to sway people. two opinions, and I try to use it for less nefarious things to produce great experiences. Obviously, I want to communicate things with my experiences. But yeah, this is where it starts to get really scary. I'll pick on China here. Should I say the People's Republic of China? Their use of gamification, bringing people online as digital individuals, ranking them in that system. And yeah, really trying to control the narrative via the sorts of interactive platforms. And also, by the kinds of content that people receive. And this could be done in a much more targeted fashion. And I think to some extent, we've only begun to learn how that's being done in recent years to drive public opinion online. And a lot of it is just classic propaganda techniques that are utilizing new forms of media to deliver things. So again, hopefully though, as people become more media literate in this stuff, they'll be able to discern when that's happening. But yeah, it does require some critical thought. And in terms of the users, I don't know if it'll make them have critical thought, because the real goal in media, it's sort of like when someone working in lighting in a film, or the cinematographer, let's say, when the cinematographer has done their job, you don't notice almost, and you don't go, wow, that's some really great cinematography. You just think, wow, it's gorgeous, right? It becomes almost transparent. So when this is done well, it won't have someone saying, what did I just do there? But at the end of the day, they'll have a story that comes out of that experience that might provoke them to have some deeper thoughts later. Like, again, when you experience catharsis watching a great movie, and you kind of put it down and walk away, you have that moment and you go, oh my gosh, and you reflect on that in your real life. And that's the real goal. That's shifting gears a little bit. What I worry about with the culture of designing for addiction and designing for compulsion loops is you want to, a lot of people want to keep players trapped in these systems, in these repetitive loops for profit. And so they can say, hey, look how many people are in my virtual world now. But for me, I sort of have the opposite goal. I want people to walk away from it, and on the other side to have some reflection about it and what it means relative to their real world experiences.
Well, that's amazing. It's great to it's great to do you want to say something, Priscilla?
No, that's great. We are coming to the end, and I want that I would like if Stephen could tell us a little more about your new game.
Sure. Yeah. Past few years, I guess I've worked on a few games, but the bulk of my time has been spent on Giant Lands, which I guess you see the graphic of here that I'm using. So Giant Lands is a role-playing game that is really traditional in some ways, but is also very untraditional in other ways. Because while you play it like Dungeons and Dragons around the table with your friends, you're also encouraged to sort of dress up and go out and play it in real life. So we're working right now on kind of a mixed reality park. So you'll be able to experience this theme park in a virtual way, as well as someday soon in the real world. And this really comes out of my recent projects, or projects of recent years, should I say, of trying to translate games into these mixed reality experiences. So with my latest project, it was Super Nintendo World, it was a license. Evermore Park was another place I worked on. It's had sort of its own original story world, but not really much of a game. There was some of it built in. And I left there and I really wanted to make an original game that I could develop into an experiential park that really kind of blends virtual and actual. So at this point, we've just released the core box set, and it's, I guess I don't have them here in front of me, but it's like 3 books and dice. It's very much a traditional, almost board game. But trying to get users to think about who they'll become in the future. So it takes place in the future after a great cataclysm, and sort of this civilization gets destroyed, and invite people to kind of bring the spirits of their ancestors back, and to really think of new ways we can live as humanity here on Earth.
Nice. So you're combining the best of both worlds.
That's the hope, right? And trying to create something sort of unique and outside of traditional fantasy and sci-fi. It's particularly focused on the Americas, and bringing back the spirits of the ancestors of the Americas.
That's amazing. That I cannot wait. Like, does it have a launch date?
We already started shipping. We started shipping in late December. Today, I'm actually shipping a bunch of international orders. I know one of them is going to Brazil today. I've had some people, I know there's a big appetite for role-playing games in Brazil.
Yeah.
But I will probably have to wait till someone wants to translate it into Portuguese. I have had some people express interest, but nothing firm yet.
Okay, cool. Like, count me in to help. Like, I would love to. I am very interested about that.
Cool.
So
I guess I'm talking to the guy. I wasn't even thinking about that. So yeah, let's talk about it after, because it's all written, it's all done. But yeah, it needs to be translated for a Portuguese audience.
Oh, great. Well, great things like this. Like, it's amazing to be part of it, to help in any kind of way. Priscilla, thank you so much for bringing Steven. Steven, thank you so much
for inviting me.
I'm very happy that he accepts the invite. I'm very happy that you are here in the VR Day, Steven.
Oh, I couldn't say no. What's that?
I'm very happy that you are here in the VR Day.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm very glad to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation, and for you both for taking the time and for expressing your interest in my work. I hope this does well for you, and I'm happy to help as I can.
It's amazing. We hope to see you in the future, to talk to you more in the future, so we can exchange ideas and propel more of about your game and whatever is that you are working on.
Thanks so much. Well, happy VR Day, all. Enjoy it, and enjoy these great talks. Brazil, I've spoken in Brazil only once before at the Festival do Rio, and I know it's a very creative place full of a lot of talent. So hopefully this gets people thinking and gets some new ideas out there.
Awesome. It will. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.